Well, thank you, Bill, for that wonderful introduction. I don't know that I'm going to be able to outdo that. But first, I want to say, like I think many of the folks in the room here today, I'm proud to be a friend of Bill. I know a lot of folks in this room are old friends of Bill's, and I know many of you also are new friends of Bill's, and I'm one of the new ones. When Bill moved down to Princeton about 2 years ago, we were fortunate enough to meet early on and realize that we were kind of common travelers and had a lot in common, and it's been a pleasure, Bill, to work with you on this event. And some of the genesis of this was after Sandy, as we sat around, as I think probably a lot of folks in this room did, saying, well, what can we do about this? How do we stop this from happening again? And, I think most folks, myself included, are more inclined to sit around and gnash our teeth and pull our hair. That's why I have so little left. Bill is one of those rare folks who really has an ability to energize people and move them to action. And when Bill called me, and after months of our talking about we should do something like Nichi, he called me up probably about a month and a half, 2 months ago, and said, we're going. I've booked the Kennedy Library. This event's going to happen. We need to make it happen. Let's get going. And Dwayne Morris is proud to support Bill and Nichi in this effort to really develop the advocacy, the coordinated, concerted advocacy across the board of industries, regions, and partisan groups, because we all know, those in the room, I think most of us are true believers in understanding the need to do something here. This group doesn't really need to be convinced of the need for action. But as Bill, I think, properly put his finger right on the issue, there's a sense of fatalism that we all have, that, well, it can't be done. And you look at what we just went through with the sequestration and what goes on in Washington and the difficulties that our president has had and that the Congress has in simply moving forward. But rather than sitting in our houses and saying what's going to happen, it really is incumbent, and Bill's call to action is absolutely on point. It's really incumbent on each and every one of us in whatever walk of life we find ourselves in, whether we're government official, elected official, in business, in labor, in academia, to really bring to bear the sort of energy and commitment to move forward. And the goal here, and Dwayne Moore, and I think I'm very fortunate to have partners in my firm who see the value in taking a lead and driving the issue and driving the call and to advocate for the sort of funding that needs to be put in place. We've got a ton of local action going on, and we're going to hear about that later on today. The question is, are we going to come up with the political will and the capital to make these plans a reality? And I think a very important person in helping convince those who are not yet convinced that it really is time is our morning keynote speaker, Cynthia Rosenzweig, and it's really my honor to have the opportunity to introduce Cynthia. Cynthia really is probably the leading person in the field of climate change, and in particularly the impact of climate change. And I know a lot of her work has been in the urban area lately, but a lot of her work she's really looked at these issues, I think, across the country. And perhaps from a political perspective, knowing where the opposition to federal funding comes from these days, some of her most important work may involve her research that she's done in the past in the field of climate change in agriculture and the areas where not our coastal areas. Because at the end of the day, we have to convince the Congress that there is a need for all of us to support this effort. Cynthia is currently senior research scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. So it's great to have a rocket scientist here to address us on the issue. She has a bachelor's and her master's degrees from the great University of New Jersey, also known as Rutgers University Cook College. She received her PhD from the great University of Massachusetts. So she kind of had the perfect background for Bill, a guy from Massachusetts, and me, a guy from New Jersey. At NASA, Cynthia's job is to head the Climate Impact Group at NASA. She co-chaired the New York City panel on climate change, and she has co-chaired numerous panels and groups that have formed to study these issues. I know she's been very involved both in Mayor Bloomberg's very progressive planning for the city of New York, as well as Governor Cuomo's very progressive planning for the state of New York. And I think those two officials really are going to be, they are leaders in exactly the issue that we're talking about here today. Cynthia is one of really their key people that they have leaned on. I think when you put together Cynthia's body of work, Nature probably said it best, the publication Nature, when they named her last year to their 10 People Who Mattered in 2012. Cynthia Rosenzweig matters a great deal in this area. She's going to continue to matter a great deal in this area, and it's my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce her this morning to really help us understand exactly what it is that we confront. Thank you very much. Cynthia.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank Bill Golden and the National Institute for Coastal and Harbor Infrastructure for inviting me to speak today. While the focus of today's symposium is on our national, the U.S. national needs in regard to coastal infrastructure and climate change, our thoughts still also go out to the people in the Philippines with the loss of life and livelihoods that they have experienced from the strength of the typhoon there. That sets the larger context of what we do in the United States also matters internationally, and the leadership that we can provide here is very important internationally as well. So today I want to talk about the climate challenges for coastal zones, and I'm going to particularly share lessons from New York City and Hurricane Sandy. All set up. You and I checked it, right? It's very hard. It's hard to have a NASA scientist talk without their PowerPoints. But if I have to, I will. I can go get my stick again. What happened to it? Reload it? Okay, I'm going to go get my stick.
While we're addressing this technical issue, I would also like to focus on another participant today. The Boston New England Marine Trades Council is here in force today. When we talk about this being a first in the nation meeting, engineers have gotten together, government officials have gotten together, labor has gotten together, private sector interests like insurance and banking have gotten together. But I think it is a rare occasion where everyone has gotten together at the same time. And it's going to be, as Paul mentioned, we need to build a coalition that has political muscle. And that muscle is going to come in many different ways. But I'm very grateful that We have organized labor supporting us here today and hopefully supporting this whole effort as we move forward. Very important component of this coalition. And with regard to the Philippines, I had meant to say something about this earlier. It is a very serious situation in the Philippines. I don't know if you've kept up with this, but the Philippines have lost thousands and thousands and thousands of lives as a result of the impact of this typhoon. And if we look at what's happening around the world, if we look at Katrina, if we look at Sandy, if we look at Holland that had a huge northeaster in late October that was not a hurricane, but one that definitely was an extreme weather event. These storms are coming, and they're coming with greater ferocity and greater regularity. And I think this is also something that's going to move us forward. Each one is a reminder that we have not put together a national policy to address these issues. And each one is going to propel this organization and energize this organization. So with that said, Dr. Rosenzweig.
Thank you. All right, we'll see if this works. All right, here we go. Let's see if it's here. Yes. All right, here's the outline. First, what are the climate change challenges in coastal zones? There's sort of a lot of hand-waving about that, but what are those challenges really? Then I want to turn to how New York City has organized its adaptation process. The key operative word there is process. Adaptation is a process. It is not a one-time, we're going to do one thing and that's going to be it and we're going to be all set and protected. Then I'll turn specifically to responding to Hurricane Sandy in New York City, and then end with Hurricane Sandy as a tipping point. In climate science, we have this concept of tipping points, which is in a physical process that builds up slowly over time, reaches a threshold, and then has rapid acceleration after that tipping point. And I really believe, and I think that this symposium today is showing that Hurricane Sandy is being a tipping point in the response to climate change as well. So, this is some findings from the draft National Climate Assessment on the coastal zones. And turn this so I can see it. What's important is that this report is coming out, is due to come out next March. And for there have been 2 or 3 other national assessments, but it's very important that there is a national view on what are the major risks of climate change and pathways for adaptation nationally. And these are the key findings on the coastal zone that will be more or less like this as it goes through the final review processes. So here they are. Coastal zones are increasingly vulnerable to higher sea levels and storm surges, inland flooding, and other climate-related changes. Why do we care about this? We care about this because of what's in the second bullet, that this increases exposure of important assets, just as Bill and Paul and Kurt Spalding have been sharing with us this morning. Exposure of important assets such as the ports, tourism, fishing sites in already vulnerable coastal locations. And this threatens to disrupt economic activity. The final point is that these coastal vulnerabilities affect the people who live in the coastal zones, and that their livelihoods are threatened, so that the assets are linked directly to the people who live and work in coastal areas. Now, several speakers so far have emphasized that the regions are leading the way, really, in responding to climate change.
And these are findings from from the ClimAid report, which was done in New York State. And here, and these are generally valid for all of for the Northeast. Here we see higher water levels, strong winds, heavy precipitation from coastal storms already are impacting our areas, and that the warming ocean waters raise sea levels through thermal expansion. And this is one of the main reasons why we have sea level rise already and why the sea level rise is projected to increase. There's also the melting of the land ice as well. So we're already seeing barrier islands being significantly altered, and these risks will be increased as we go into the future. So how did New York City organize its adaptation process? What lessons could we learn for other regions and perhaps for national best practice, to create national best practices? So the first one is right at the top, leadership. In New York City, Mayor Bloomberg has taken on the climate change issue and has been a leader in making response to climate change a major effort of his administration. The second key best practice is coordination. Climate change and adapting to climate change, if we just even take coastal areas, tremendously complex. And that's why there has to be coordinating bodies that are going to bring the various groups together. And in perhaps President Obama's commissions that he's setting up are going to help to provide this coordinating role. In the case of New York, it's called the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. By the way, this is actually a good point, that sustainability is a larger frame that then climate change comes into. That's I think, a key point in New York as well. Then we have on the left, we have all the agencies that are in charge. They manage the critical infrastructure. They came together in the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. At the end of this, well, it's still ongoing, but at first it started with about 20 agencies, and then by the end it was 30 or 40, and people were calling up and saying to the coordinating body and say, we want to join, because one agency on its own, or one private, for example, all the cell phone providers were there, they can't be taking on the challenges of developing an adaptation plan all by themselves. It's just, it's too complicated. And also it needs to be coordinated so that the interdependencies across these agencies, across water, energy, communication, are dealt with in a coordinated fashion. So that's the bodies that are responsible for implementing the adaptations. Then on the right-hand side is the other part of the process, which is the part that I'm part of, which is the climate science and the knowledge about climate change that's needed to actually carry forward with the implementation. And in our group, we had university scholars, private sector experts. So for example, we had Swiss Re reinsurance experts they are risk experts, for example. And we provide the climate information, risk information that's needed for the implementations to actually take place. So this was done by Mayor Bloomberg, who convened the first New York City panel on climate change in 2008. And we provide foundation reports so that the entire region can utilize the same set of coordinated climate risk information. And I just gave Bill a copy of our report. Another key part is that before Hurricane Sandy in August, and Mayor Bloomberg signed it in September of 2012, the New York City Panel on Climate Change was codified into law so that for every coming administration, the climate knowledge providers are going to provide updated climate risk information. This is also very important because climate change
means, right? There are two words, climate and change. Because climate is changing, we can't have one report. We say, scientists, tell us what climate change is, give us the report, thank you very much, and go away. The climate system is evolving, it's changing. And while we have projections of what those changes will be, we have to be continuously monitoring and learning to see how the climate change is actually progressing. And that's why, and this makes it challenging for democracy in which administrations change. And so what if the next mayor, although we hope Mayor-elect de Blasio will care as much about climate change as Mayor Bloomberg has. Now we have an ongoing body to provide the climate risk information. Now, another key part is to have a framework for thinking about adaptation. And this in New York, and the NPCC created such a framework called Flexible Adaptation Pathways. And this schematic is showing what we mean by this. This can be a guiding principle. This sets the guiding principle for a region. And here we have risks going up on the y-axis, time going across. And there's a wavy blue line, which is it's called the societal acceptable level of risk. This is what can our citizens actually withstand? Now, at first we had that a straight line, but it actually goes up and down because, for example, after we have a Hurricane Sandy, right, the risk tolerance actually is lower. People realize we need to be prepared. So we need to understand that societal levels of acceptable levels of risk are changing as we go forward too. Now, the blue straight line is if we do nothing, and we keep all of our coastal structures and infrastructure just the way we are now. Eventually, we will for sure, because of climate change, risks going up, we will cross that level of risk. So we need to do something. But if we only do one thing, if we just choose one thing and go on the orange and say, yes, we're done, we will delay crossing the level of risk, the acceptable level of risk, but we will for sure eventually cross it. So the challenge of what we need to do as an entire coastal society is to stay, and it's actually on the yellow, but it's yellow and green lines, it's actually the green. The yellow line is a flexible adaptation pathway in which we take some measures, we monitor and reassess, and then when needed, we reduce risk. Then when we monitor, and when we have to do further things and be flexible in our adaptations, we continue through time. That's very good for the adaptation side, but there's one more piece, which is what the green line includes as well, which is mitigation of climate change, which is reduction of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, thereby reducing the ultimate magnitude and rate of change of the risks. In order to be truly responsible, and we were just talking with Paul earlier, and Bill, we really also need to talk about how the Institute will handle and work towards mitigation as well as adaptation. It's only when you do both are we going to be able, as a society, and coastal societies in particular, to stay below the acceptable levels of risk. Now, New York City also, there are lots of these around us. As Kurt says, there's all these tools and decision support. This is an example of one of them, the steps that we helped develop in New York City for, well, how do you actually figure out adaptations? You go through a risk management process, which all corporations and managers are very familiar with. You identify current and future climate hazards. You conduct an inventory of your infrastructure and assets. You identify vulnerabilities. You characterize them. Which ones are the most critical? Which ones can we wait on? And then we develop strategies. We identify opportunities for coordination. That's a key part of what the Institute, I believe, is about.
then we prioritize strategies. We won't be able to do everything all at once, and we certainly won't be able to pay for it. What will we do first? You have to go through this process to decide. And then you prepare and implement the resilience plans. And the final one, as I was saying, monitor and reassess because of that second word in climate change. Now, when we think about adaptation also, what are we talking about? How do we, what is adaptation to climate change? First of all, what does it entail in terms of the definitions? It reduces the level of physical, social, and economic impacts of climate. And also there's the potential, and this is also very important, to take advantage of new opportunities. Not every single thing about climate change is bad. Certainly in the later years, the significant risks increase. But for example, warmer winters, there might be some people in Boston who might like that. My sister lives here, and she hates the cold winters. So we have to be very clear and honest about some potential opportunities as well. But now, we have to think about types of adaptation. There's management and operations. Right now, in heavy inland flooding, I'm sure the crews in Boston are out cleaning the drains already. That's the simplest adaptation. Management and operations doesn't cost a lot of money. We can do this right now, and I'm sure Boston crews are doing that. New York is too. But of course, infrastructure will be needed. Infrastructure changes will be needed. But of course, there's policies. Insurance policies are part of adaptation as well. Adaptation, in terms of groups, who does adaptation? Of course, private as well as public groups. And then we see the telescoping of scales, the local and municipal, county, state, and national. And this is one of the main challenges, to get all of these multiple jurisdictions working in an aligned way. Levels of efforts can be small or large. We have to really think about this as a portfolio approach, not just one solution, such as, oh, let's just put up barriers, and that's going to solve everything. And then what's our timing of our strategies as well? Are they short-term, medium, or long? So, what resulted in the New York City process before Hurricane Sandy? This, by the way, was one of the top questions that the media asked us. Was New York prepared? And after struggling to answer that question, because they wanted us to say, no, New York was not ready. But that's not true. New York had implemented things because of that work that we had been doing that I was just describing. I came finally to tell the media that New York had been in low gear in terms of developing climate resilience before Hurricane Sandy, and after Hurricane Sandy has moved into high gear. But just for example, to give some of the examples of what New York has done, it planted over 300 green streets, vegetation that absorbs stormwater. It was doing the LIDAR. It had gotten the LIDAR so that it would know what it would much more critically and more correctly know the elevations of the coast. It had incorporated sea level rise into its comprehensive waterfront planning. And very importantly, it had developed the evacuation. It had extended and advanced its evacuation plan. But then Hurricane Sandy came along just a little over 1 year ago. And it was a very unusual storm. And this is very important because these storms and surprises can happen. Hurricane Sandy will never happen again, but there can be other storms with other surprises. The storm timing coincided almost exactly with the high tides. It was a very large storm extending over 1,000 miles, and there's the top two panels are comparing to Hurricane Katrina, which was not as wide in extent of the storm. And it created a storm tide of over 14 feet above the main tide gauge at the battery, the tide level. And it had a very unusual storm track. Remember how it was going up north, and then it veered inward, landward, in a very unusual way.
One thing that's very important for science, which is cut off, I see it on mine, in red at the bottom it says that the storm was forecast well in advance. This is very important for science, very important for climate change. Because if we can do a good job forecasting our near-term big storms, this is also, it builds confidence in the models which are used in the longer term as well to project climate change. Now, I have to talk about the links of Hurricane Sandy to climate change science. This is extremely important. This was the second big media question that was asked. Was Hurricane Sandy climate change? The answer is no. Climate, by definition, is long-term weather. No one storm will ever prove climate change. But we can say that the sea level rise that has already occurred, there has been 1 foot of sea level rise in New York City already, for sure exacerbated the coastal flooding that Hurricane Sandy caused. So there is a direct link, because some of that sea level rise, not all, some of it is glacial, but remember I was talking about the thermal expansion and the melting of the land-based ice. Now, it's also very important to know that there has been an increase of the intensity of severe hurricanes. This is in the Northeast. This is in the actually North Atlantic. You can see that's what the second panel is showing. This is an area of research, but it is it's definitely intense storms are on the rise over our larger area. And there may also be a connection to the melting of the sea ice in the polar regions, which may have affected the jet stream and may have affected that left hook. But what we're also very clear about as we talk about the climate science to decision makers and to the general public, we work very hard to be clear about what we can say for certain and what are areas of research, so that we're not saying everything is climate change. We're also teaching about the process of learning about the climate system, which is part of this flexible adaptation pathways and monitoring and reassessing. So in the immediate, because it was well forecast, the storm, there were preparations. So New York City issued the mandatory evacuation of Zone A, and many thousands of people evacuated. Out-of-state utility crews were brought in. The MTA closed down its operations. It moved its rolling stock. And I think in contrast to New Jersey Transit, which did not move its rolling stock, sorry, apologies for bringing that up for the folks from New Jersey. And they placed sandbags at the entrances. And a lot of these things were done because they hadn't been done very many times before. And I do believe that the New York City Panel on Climate Change and working with the climate scientists, becoming aware of the risks of climate change, helped, because we've worked with the MTA now for years, and it helped to make these kinds of decisions, and OEM in New York, that reduced loss of life. Because when you contrast the loss of life, which was only, this is in New York City, 43 people, of course, every loss of life must be avoided. But you can see that definitely loss of life and damage was reduced. However, utilities not prepared, 4 million without power for weeks in the tri-state area, and we did have major flooding, but by closing, we did reduce damage. Now, I said that the storm was well forecast. What about the impacts? What happened with the storm? It turns out these were well forecast too, because of the series of foundation reports, which started back actually 15 years ago. And in the maps, in these reports, you can see the vulnerable areas, which indeed were the hardest hit in Sandy. Overall, these reports revealed two major vulnerabilities. One is the interdependent critical infrastructure systems, which is what this group is really focused on. It also
revealed the vulnerable communities that we have in our densely populated coastal areas. However, there were always some surprises, and these were the ones that were unforeseen. The hospital evacuations, we just didn't think that we were going to have to evacuate those hospitals. The gas shortages, which were caused by severe breakdowns in the supply chain of the gas. And then the fires in some of the really tiny coastal communities, which were a combination of electrical fires with interaction of the electricity, the seawater, and then the narrowly flooded streets hampered emergency response. There are always going to be surprises, so we have to prepare. How do you prepare for a surprise? We have to be ready for them. We have to do as much as we possibly can. These were some of the surprises of Sandy. So immediately following the storm, Mayor Bloomberg reconvened the New York City Panel on Climate Change and asked us to prepare an updated climate risk information for 2013. Because in the meantime, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change had been preparing their fifth assessment report. But I just want to, I don't know if you can see it, and so we did a new report. We worked 24/7. Science, proceeds actually like on a slower time frame, but we had to work. We really worked from January until June we worked to provide the new updated risk information that went along with the plan, which I'm going to describe. This stronger, more resilient New York, which was the actual plan for rebuilding and creating a resilient New York. And so I just want to read this. You may not be able to read it, but I think it applies to Boston too. Resilient. It's the definition. Able to bounce back after change or adversity, capable of preparing for, responding to, and recovering from difficult conditions. Synonym, tough. See also New York City. But I would also say Boston as well, because we're sisters cities here on the Northeast. I want to here mention, besides the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which was just focused on the New York metropolitan region, NOAA has a program that has regional programs throughout the country called RISA, which stands for Regional Integrated Science and Assessment. And we have one in the urban Northeast. It's called CC Run, Consortium for Climate Risk. And this stretches from Boston, and the work of the scientists here stretch from Boston to Philadelphia. And the CC Run actually led the technical team that developed the projections for the NPCC2 report. And here's what here are the updated findings. A broad-based acceleration of climate change in coming decades, significant climate risks. Let's not forget heat waves and the extreme precipitation events, even as we're focused on coastal flooding. This is valid not just for New York City, but for the whole New York region. I won't read the fine print, but in this report, and it's on the web already, you can look up to see how many degrees Fahrenheit, how many inches of sea level rise, et cetera, et cetera. This is because if we're really going to be serious about infrastructure, that building, we have to know what these projections are. And what New York City did with these is make a very detailed plan for coastal protection. And these are just some examples of how detailed their plans were able to be. Increasing coastal edge elevations, minimizing upland wave zones, protecting against storm surges. That's where the local storm surge barriers come in. Improving coastal design and improving governance, a very key part. You can't only just think about infrastructure. You have to think about how the governance of the infrastructure and the telescoping scales are handled. And then I put in a whole slide about insurance. Again, I'm not going I won't go into the details. But this illustrates that there are, remember, we have engineering solutions, we have ecosystem-based solutions with the wetlands, for example, the dunes, and we also have policy adaptations as well. This, you can see that what New York did was create a portfolio of adaptations, and clearly insurance that targets affordable solutions for low-income policy holders, defining resiliency standards for buildings. There are lots of lawyers here. These are the kinds of things that we'll be turning to the lawyers to really, and the engineers, to be creating these new kinds of regulations. Expanding pricing options. There's so much that can be done with insurance, and this will clearly be a critical part of the federal response as well. And already there has been with the Bigger Waters Act. This work has already begun. Oh, and what the graph is showing is that Sandy may be, it's looking as if it's going to be the third most costliest storm for the United States. So this is the final slide. Hurricane Sandy as tipping point. I really do believe that Hurricane Sandy is the tipping point for this country in terms of responding to increasing climate risks due to climate change. First of all, New York really did lead the way. New York City is a leader. It's a cultural leader. All the media are there. For a number of reasons, it was able to really take a leadership role. A key part is in the response is in New York City, is that there was, and continues to be municipal, state, and federal alignment. Mayor Bloomberg, Governor Cuomo, and President Obama all publicly spoke about the need to include increasing climate risks in the spending of the funds of the appropriations for resiliency development. This alignment of the telescoping jurisdictions is, I believe, a very key point. The third is about the climate science. The climate science, I call it, was in place and in time. Because you can't have a storm like Sandy and have Mayor Bloomberg call us up for the first time the day after. You will not get the understanding of what the risks actually are, so that the science and the development of the climate risk information, and that's why the National Climate Assessment process is so important, that we as a nation are finally getting our act together nationally, so that we can have climate science in place and time everywhere, not just in the fortunate places like New York City, because we happen to have Columbia and NASA GIS and all the great universities and risk management firms we have there. And so those, I believe, are why it's a tipping point. I believe very strongly as we go forward, I want to emphasize this again, that we need federal coordination that recognizes local and state initiatives, because one of the things that we've done as part of this is work with NOAA and Army Corps of Engineers, and it's been great because they recognized that there was the detailed hyper-local projections that were better than any national projections could possibly be. So just as we have to have a flexible approach for our pathways of adaptation, we have to build in flexibility into our policies, into our jurisdictional relationships as well. So I wanted to emphasize that as a final challenge. But I want to say at the end, I wish the Institute really all the best. I look forward to helping to host the meeting in New York when you come for when you hold the National Symposium there. And I really very much support this effort and look forward to working with you on it. Thank you very much.